I want you to pause for a moment and really sit with the gravity of what is unfolding right now, because this is not just another diplomatic exchange between neighboring countries, not just another trade dispute that will be resolved through technical negotiations and face-saving compromises, and certainly not just another example of political posturing that generates headlines before both sides return to business as usual. What we are witnessing is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau making a calculated decision to publicly expose and reject what he characterizes as American economic coercion, delivering a statement 5 minutes ago that was remarkable not for its diplomatic language, but for its deliberate bluntness. And the decision to speak publicly rather than negotiate privately represents a fundamental break in how Canada manages the relationship with its overwhelmingly powerful neighbor. I have spent decades watching power from the inside. First, as a Republican operative who helped architect the institutional frameworks that governed executive authority and interstate relations. Then, as a constitutional lawyer who has litigated cases about federal power, international agreements, and the constitutional limits of executive action in foreign affairs. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, what Trudeau said 5 minutes ago, his public rejection of what he explicitly called American attempts to subordinate Canadian sovereignty to American political demands, is not the frustrated outburst of a leader losing political support at home. It is a strategic decision by a prime minister who has concluded that private accommodation with the Trump administration is impossible, that public confrontation serves Canadian interests better than quiet capitulation, and that the political and economic costs of appearing weak before American pressure now exceed the costs of open conflict with Canada's largest trading partner. So I want you to ask yourself three questions. First, what happens when the leader of America's most integrated ally decides that speaking publicly about American coercion serves his interests better than maintaining the diplomatic fiction that the relationship is between partners rather than between a dominant power and a subordinate neighbor? Second, what happens when Trudeau's statement, which explicitly detailed American threats to impose tariffs on Canadian aluminum, lumber, and energy exports unless Canada accepts American demands on immigration enforcement, removes the carefully maintained ambiguity that has allowed both governments to claim they're defending their interests while actually compromising? And third, what happens when Canadian public opinion, which polling shows is already supportive of Trudeau's firm stance by a margin of 68% to 24%, hardens further in response to what Canadians now understand are explicit American threats, making any future Canadian compromise appear as capitulation and making bilateral cooperation politically toxic for any Canadian government, regardless of party? These are not theoretical questions. These are being answered right now in real time in caucus meetings where Canadian parliamentarians are calculating the political costs of appearing soft on American pressure. In corporate boardrooms where executives are gaming out scenarios where trade conflict escalates rather than resolves. And in capitals around the world where middle powers are watching to see whether standing up to American pressure is viable or suicidal. Systems don't collapse overnight. They erode slowly through moments exactly like this. And the erosion we are watching began when President Trump decided that threatening America's closest ally with economic destruction was an acceptable negotiating tactic, and accelerated 5 minutes ago when Justin Trudeau decided that exposing those threats publicly served Canadian interests better than absorbing them quietly. For more than 75 years, since the end of World War II transformed both countries and created the framework for modern economic integration, the United States and Canada had developed a relationship management system that both governments understood, even though it was never formally codified or publicly acknowledged in its full complexity. Not because the relationship was perfectly harmonious or because interests always aligned, but because both governments learned through experience what worked in managing the enormous power asymmetry between a superpower and a middle power that shared the world's longest border and conducted more bilateral trade than any other country pair. The system was built on carefully maintained fictions that served both sides. The United States maintained the public position that Canada was a sovereign equal, an ally whose interests were respected and whose cooperation was voluntary rather than coerced. This fiction allowed American presidents to claim they led alliances based on shared values rather than on raw power, and it allowed international audiences to view American leadership as legitimate rather than as hegemonic domination. Canada maintained the public position that the relationship was between partners, that Canadian sovereignty was intact, and that Canadian cooperation with American priorities reflected Canadian interests rather than Canadian subordination to American power. This fiction allowed Canadian prime ministers to maintain domestic legitimacy, to present cooperation as strategic choice rather than as capitulation to overwhelming pressure, and to preserve the psychological independence that Canadians needed to distinguish themselves from their overwhelmingly powerful neighbor. The system worked because both governments understood that the fictions needed to be maintained through rhetoric, even when the reality was more complex. American administrations, whether Democratic or Republican, understood that treating Canada with public respect, acknowledging Canadian sovereignty in diplomatic language, and negotiating through established channels rather than through public ultimatums allowed Canadian governments to cooperate without appearing subordinate. Canadian governments understood that cooperation on American security priorities, facilitation of trade that benefited both countries, and diplomatic support on international issues gave Canada influence and protected Canadian interests more effectively than symbolic gestures of independence would have. That boring, hypocritical, pragmatic accommodation enabled extraordinary economic integration that generated prosperity on both sides of the border. It enabled security cooperation that made both countries safer. It enabled diplomatic coordination that amplified both countries' influence in international forums. When diplomats describe the US-Canada relationship as the closest bilateral relationship in history, they meant this system: power asymmetry managed through mutual respect, cooperation maintained through careful diplomacy, and conflicts resolved through private negotiation that preserved public fictions that served both sides. The relationship represented decades of institutional learning about what triggered Canadian nationalist backlash, what allowed Canadian governments to cooperate without losing domestic legitimacy, and how to manage differences without activating the enormous latent resentment that exists in any relationship where one party is 10 times more powerful than the other. But that assumption of careful management, that understanding that maintaining public fictions allowed private accommodation, has been systematically destroyed in the span of 3 weeks by an American administration that either doesn't understand these dynamics or has decided that they don't matter. What triggered this moment wasn't a policy disagreement that could be managed through the established diplomatic mechanisms that exist precisely for resolving bilateral tensions without creating public crisis. It was a series of escalating public threats delivered through press conferences, social media posts, and statements to reporters, making explicit what had always been carefully left implicit: that American cooperation with Canada was conditional on Canadian compliance with American demands, and that non-compliance would be punished through economic measures designed to inflict maximum pain. The threats weren't framed as opening negotiations between sovereign equals. They were framed as ultimatums from a superior power to a subordinate that needed to be reminded of its place. The specificity of the threats revealed the deliberate nature of the pressure. Trump publicly threatened 25% tariffs on Canadian aluminum unless Canada increased border enforcement to American satisfaction on irregular migration. despite the fact that irregular crossings from Canada to the United States represent a tiny fraction of southern border flows, and despite Canadian data showing that enforcement had already been significantly enhanced. Trump threatened tariffs on Canadian lumber exports unless Canada accepted American demands on softwood lumber quota agreements that had been under negotiation for years through established trade dispute mechanisms. Trump threatened tariffs on Canadian energy exports, including crude oil and electricity, unless Canada demonstrated what he characterized as sufficient cooperation on continental security, language vague enough to encompass whatever future demands might emerge. The threats weren't accompanied by serious negotiations or by attempts to reach compromises through diplomatic channels. They were delivered publicly, deliberately, with language designed to humiliate and to force capitulation. For Trudeau, who leads a minority government dependent on opposition party support and who governs in a political environment where Canadian nationalism and resentment of American dominance are powerful forces across the political spectrum, the threats created an impossible situation that made the careful fiction of partnership unsustainable. Agreeing to the demands, even partially, would confirm the characterization of Canada as subordinate to American power, and would validate Trump's approach of public threats as an effective tool for managing the relationship. Future demands would inevitably follow because the precedent would establish that threats worked. Rejecting the demands risked economic conflict that would damage Canadian industries and would cost jobs in provinces where economic conditions were already challenging. Both options carried severe costs, but one preserved the fundamental principle that Canada makes its own decisions based on Canadian interests rather than on American threats. The other sacrificed that principle for temporary relief that would be revoked the moment Trump decided another issue required Canadian compliance. And that is the line Trudeau refused to cross. But rather than negotiating privately and maintaining the public fiction of partnership while quietly accommodating some American concerns, Trudeau made a decision that represents a fundamental break in relationship management. He went public with a detailed account of exactly what Trump had threatened and exactly why Canada was refusing to comply. Within minutes of Trudeau's statement, the effects began cascading through political and economic systems in ways that revealed just how much the public exposure of the threats changed the dynamics and constrained what both governments could do next. Trudeau's statement, delivered from Parliament Hill with deliberately calm but unmistakably firm language, was remarkable for what it made explicit rather than for its emotional content. He began by noting that Canada and the United States had managed differences through diplomatic channels for decades, and that this approach had served both countries well by allowing disagreements to be resolved without public confrontation that damaged broader relationships. He then detailed, with specificity that Canadian prime ministers typically avoid, exactly what Trump had threatened. 25% tariffs on aluminum exports worth $14 billion annually unless Canada increased border enforcement beyond levels that Canadian officials considered operationally effective or constitutionally appropriate. Tariffs on lumber exports worth $7.4 billion annually unless Canada accepted quota agreements that Canadian provinces considered violations of trade agreements both countries had signed. Tariffs on energy exports, including 3.8 million barrels per day of crude oil and 60 terawatt hours of electricity, unless Canada demonstrated unspecified cooperation on security matters. Trudeau made clear these weren't negotiations. They were demands backed by threats of economic destruction designed to force compliance regardless of Canadian interests or Canadian sovereignty. When a factory stops, there's no narrative that fixes it. But when a prime minister publicly details the threats his country faces from its closest ally, you're watching diplomatic relationships being fundamentally redefined in real time. Trudeau then explained, with language calibrated for both Canadian and international audiences, Why Canada was refusing the demands. Not because Canada was unwilling to cooperate on legitimate shared concerns. Canada had already enhanced border enforcement, had invested in security infrastructure, and had been working through established channels on trade disputes. Canada was refusing because accepting demands delivered through public threats and economic coercion would establish that Canadian sovereignty was subordinate to American political whims, that Canadian policy could be dictated through threats rather than negotiated through partnership, and that future Canadian governments would face similar threats whenever American domestic politics required a target. He concluded with a statement that was remarkable for its directness. Canada will not be threatened into submission. We will not accept that our sovereignty is negotiable based on American political calculations, and we will respond to economic coercion with measures that defend Canadian interests and demonstrate that threats carry costs for those who make them. The statement was carefully calibrated but unmistakable in its implications. Canada wasn't just rejecting Trump's specific demands. Canada was rejecting the entire framework of the relationship that Trump was attempting to impose. The framework where American threats determined Canadian policy and where Canadian cooperation was coerced rather than negotiated. But the most significant element of Trudeau's statement wasn't what he said about Trump's threats. It was what he revealed about Canada's response. Canada would be implementing a series of measures announced in detail by relevant ministers over the following hours that would target American economic interests in ways designed to create political pressure in the United States for the threats to be withdrawn. As the details of Canada's response emerged, something extraordinary started happening in political calculations on both sides of the border, revealing just how much Trudeau's public strategy had changed the dynamics and how difficult it would be for either government to back down without appearing weak. The Canadian measures, announced through a coordinated series of ministerial statements over the 4 hours following Trudeau's address, were comprehensive and strategically targeted to maximize political impact in the United States while maintaining plausible deniability about their retaliatory nature. The Canadian government announced enhanced regulatory enforcement on American companies operating in Canada, focusing on environmental compliance, labor standards, and tax obligations. The measures wouldn't ban American operations or violate trade agreements, but they would subject American companies to scrutiny and enforcement that would increase costs and create operational uncertainty. Specific targets were notable. American pharmaceutical companies with Canadian manufacturing operations, American financial services firms with significant Canadian presence, American technology companies with Canadian data centers and development facilities. The message was clear. If American threats made Canadian exports to the United States uncertain, Canadian regulatory actions would make American operations in Canada equally uncertain. Canada announced that provincial utilities would be reviewing electricity export contracts with American states, examining whether continued exports at current prices served provincial interests given the changed political environment and increased supply uncertainty. The review wouldn't immediately cut off electricity flowing to Vermont, New York, Minnesota, and other states that depended on Canadian power, but it would signal that those exports couldn't be taken for granted and that future contracts would reflect the political risk that American threats had introduced. For American utilities that had built grid planning around Canadian imports being reliable and available, the signal created immediate uncertainty that would affect planning, would potentially affect credit ratings, and would definitely affect political calculations about whether supporting Trump's threats was worth the risk to electricity supply. Canada announced expedited regulatory review for non-American companies seeking to expand operations in Canada, while American companies would face normal processing times. The differential treatment was explicit economic nationalism, designed to signal that American threats made American investment less attractive and that Canada would be actively working to diversify economic relationships away from American dependence. European, Asian, and Latin American companies would now have regulatory advantages over American competitors in accessing Canadian markets and Canadian resources. But the most politically sophisticated element of Canada's response targeted specific American states and congressional districts. Canada announced that government procurement policies, which direct billions in annual spending, would prioritize non-American suppliers where viable alternatives existed. The targeting was explicit and political. Steel from Ohio would be replaced with European alternatives. Agricultural equipment from Iowa would be replaced with Canadian or Asian manufacturers. Technology contracts with companies in Texas and Florida would be reviewed and potentially redirected. The message to Republican senators and representatives from affected states was unmistakable. Supporting Trump's threats would cost jobs and revenue in their districts, and they would be held accountable by constituents who would watch Canadian procurement shift away from American suppliers. Within 6 hours of Trudeau's statement, the political effects were manifesting in ways that revealed how much the public confrontation had changed the dynamics. In Canada, public opinion polling conducted through rapid online surveys showed that 68% of Canadians supported Trudeau's firm stance against American threats, with support strongest among younger voters and urban populations, but extending across regional and political divisions. Opposition party leaders who had been criticizing Trudeau on various domestic issues issued statements supporting the government's position on defending Canadian sovereignty. The Conservative Party leader, typically aligned with business interests that favored accommodation with the United States, stated that no Canadian government of any party should accept economic threats as a substitute for diplomatic engagement. The NDP and Bloc Québécois issued even stronger statements supporting confrontation over capitulation. Trudeau had successfully made defending Canadian sovereignty a unifying national issue that transcended normal partisan divisions, making any future compromise politically difficult without appearing weak. In the United States, the political effects were more complex but potentially more significant for Trump's calculations. Republican senators from states that depended on Canadian trade or that would be affected by Canadian retaliation were making urgent calls to the White House expressing concern about the economic and political implications. Senator Susan Collins of Maine, where Canadian energy imports and cross-border commerce were economically significant, issued a statement calling for diplomatic resolution and noting that threats were counterproductive. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, concerned about precedents for resource-rich states, questioned whether economic coercion was appropriate between allies. Senator Mitt Romney, never shy about criticizing Trump, stated bluntly that threatening our closest ally with economic destruction to score domestic political points is not leadership. It's recklessness that will cost American jobs and damage relationships we depend on. But the most significant political effect was in swing states where Canadian retaliation would be most visible. Ohio steel producers who faced losing Canadian government contracts were calling congressional offices. Iowa agricultural equipment manufacturers were expressing concern about market access. Technology companies in Texas were calculating the costs of regulatory uncertainty in Canadian operations. These weren't marginal political constituencies. These were core Republican business supporters in states that Trump needed for re-election. And they were discovering that his threats to Canada carried costs for them that exceeded any benefits from appearing tough on border security. This is where the administration's fundamental miscalculation becomes impossible to ignore. The assumption seemed to be that Canada would absorb threats quietly through private diplomatic channels, make some accommodations that Trump could claim as victories, and maintain the public fiction that the relationship was cooperative rather than coercive. That assumption ignored that Trudeau had domestic political constraints that made quiet capitulation impossible. that Canadian nationalism was a powerful force that any Canadian leader needed to respect, and that going public with the threats changed the dynamics entirely by making Canadian accommodation appear as subordination visible to all Canadians rather than as diplomatic compromise negotiated privately. By threatening publicly rather than negotiating privately, Trump activated Canadian nationalist resistance that made cooperation politically toxic. By making the threats explicit and comprehensive, he made clear that this wasn't about resolving specific policy differences, but about establishing American dominance. And by underestimating Trudeau's willingness to go public with the details of American coercion, he created a situation where Canadian retaliation became not just strategically rational, but politically necessary for Trudeau's survival. And here's what those Senate offices and corporate boardrooms were beginning to understand. Once the confrontation is public, and once both leaders have staked political capital on not backing down, resolution becomes extraordinarily difficult because compromise appears as weakness to domestic audiences who are now watching and judging. Diplomatic relationships aren't built for public threats, and they don't survive them intact. They're built on careful management of power asymmetries that allows cooperation without subordination. And careful management is exactly what was sacrificed for political theater that plays to domestic audiences, but destroys the foundations of alliances that American security and prosperity depend on. The tragedy is that this was entirely avoidable. The previous system worked. Canada cooperated on American security priorities. Trade flourished. The border remained secure. Differences were resolved through diplomatic channels that preserved the fictions both sides needed. All of it could have been preserved through basic diplomatic competence, through understanding that threatening allies publicly activates nationalist resistance that makes cooperation politically impossible, through negotiating differences privately in ways that allowed both sides to claim success. Instead, it was treated as an opportunity to demonstrate dominance without regard for consequences. And now those consequences are manifesting in Canadian retaliation that damages American economic interests, in political costs that accumulate in Republican districts, in alliance relationships that are fundamentally altered by the demonstration that American partnership means American domination. The people paying the price aren't the architects of this policy. They're American workers at companies facing regulatory actions in Canada. They're American exporters losing contracts to Canadian procurement discrimination. They're residents of American states that depend on Canadian electricity facing supply uncertainty. They're American allies everywhere who are watching and recalculating the costs and benefits of alignment with Washington. They're all victims of diplomatic malpractice that treated alliances as tools of coercion rather than as strategic assets requiring careful management. The damage is done. The threats are public. The confrontation is escalating. The relationship is fundamentally altered. The question now is whether anyone in Washington understands what has been lost, and whether by the time they understand, the damage will have become permanent structural change in how allies relate to American power. Trudeau's statement 5 minutes ago suggests Canada has already made that assessment. And the assessment is that the era of quiet accommodation is over.